Everyone, this is Krish. Hope you're doing well. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about databases, right? And one aspect of it in particular. I want to talk about NoSQL versus RDBMS, traditional RDBMS databases, and why you would pick one versus the other. Of course, you can Google up the differences between traditional relational databases and NoSQL instances. And when you do that, you'll find that one of the first differences you might encounter is when you have structured data, you go with an RDBMS instance like Oracle or MySQL, Postgres, or even SQLite. And when you have more unstructured data, you go with NoSQL instances like Mongo, DynamoDB, or even Redis. Even though Redis is slightly different, it's a high-speed key value data store. It kind of falls in the space of NoSQL as well. So at the highest level, you're talking about structured versus unstructured data. But I think I want to go beyond that in this video and not delve much into that aspect of it. As an engineer, as a developer, as an architect who's writing code and using these a variety of databases on a daily basis, and not just one or the other, I tend to use them at the same time and even in a given for a given application, right? So why do I when do I prefer one versus the other? One of the reasons I enjoy using NoSQL databases is the fact that you don't have to pre-create them. And what I mean by that is this, right? So if it's a MySQL or Postgres or an Oracle schema, you have to create the schema, write the data definition languages, those scripts, create the tables and database objects, define the constraints, the columns, the data types. You have to do all of that upfront before you actually start writing code that consumes or leverages that database, which is time consuming. And then the smaller you are, the smaller the team is, and the more hats you have to wear, the more time consuming it becomes. With NoSQL instances, you have the flexibility of not having to predefine this. So I don't need to have a schema. I can create, what's called a table in RDBMS is called a collection. In NoSQL, what's called a record or a row in RDBMS is called a document here. So let's say I create, let's take an example of, just so we can understand this better, right? I just had lunch, so I'm thinking of restaurants. So bear with me because I didn't think this part through, so I might have to retract some of what I say here. So let's say you have restaurants. Let's say you create a table for storing those restaurants. Each record has a restaurant and restaurant's name, location, address, whatnot. And let's say you have another table for say franchises, because a restaurant can have any number of franchises. So there's a one-to-one relationship, right? So you could have a franchises table with n number of franchises, and it has a foreign key back to the restaurants table. And let's add a end-to-end relationship as well, just to take this one step further. Okay, so let's say a restaurant can be owned by any number of people, 1 to n number of people, and an owner can own one or more restaurants. So you have an end-to-end relationship between restaurants and owners and the ownership. So you would have an owners table with a list of owners with the basic metadata about that owner, and then you're going to have like a join table. Let's call it restaurants owners that establishes the end-to-end mapping between these two entities. So you have 4 tables here in RDBMS. Let's see how it might be modeled in NoSQL, right? So you would have a restaurants collection, much like the table, with each document in the collection that has details about that restaurant. You will also have a franchises collection with the number of documents for franchises, and each of them having a reference back to the restaurants document in the collection. So that part of the relationship is quite similar to the RDBMS instance. But where it's going to change is the end-to-end. You're going to have a third collection called owners, which has a list of owners. But remember, we had the restaurants owners mapping in the RDBMS scenario. You wouldn't need that here, because in the owners collection, you have a number of owners documents. And one of the attributes in the owners document would be, say, an array of restaurant IDs that points to the restaurant documents in the restaurant's collection. So that basically says that the single owner can own any number of restaurants. Now, what about the other side, the converse of the relationship, where a restaurant can be owned by multiple owners? You don't need to store that anywhere. There is no need for a joint sort of a table or an equivalent collection. You are able to write queries on the owner's collection to get all the restaurants owned by an owner, which is straightforward because it's all part of one document. But if you want all the owners of a given restaurant, you still can just go into that collection. And since each of those documents has an array of restaurant IDs, you could write a query very easily to essentially extract that information that gives you all the owners for a given restaurant as well. So you see that in this case you have one less database object, but that's just one of the advantages. I mean that's just a different way of doing it. You may not even think it's an advantage, but I think you don't have to create these dark collections and to establish these mappings and relationships, and you'll have much fewer number of overall collections in the case of the NoSQL instance, at least from what I've seen through experience. What's also nice is since you don't have to pre-seed and write these DDL scripts, let's say you want to add a preferred contact number for owners, unlike the RDBMS scenario where you would have had to go write migrations, Rails calls it migrations, you could call it whatever, you go make those changes, update the schema, alter the table, and do the needful before you write the code. In the case of the NoSQL instance, you could just change your code to so the model essentially starts populating a preferred contact number. Of course, if you want to have a preferred number for every other owner that's out there, you would have to write some scripts. But let's say you don't care for the previous owners to have preferred contact numbers and you have a fallback mechanism. You just want the new owners going forward to have preferred contact numbers. Then it's like super easy. There's no database change that you even need to make here. So what I've seen is in a smaller shop, in a startup, or even in a slightly mid-sized organization that functions like a startup, where you don't necessarily have a DBA or a DevOps person or a developer, an architect, a tester. Sometimes you wear multiple hats and do all different kinds of things. And not having to do more is obviously better. So you can just focus on writing more code and implementing those features. I've seen that using a NoSQL instance has made me a whole lot more productive. But of course, if you're working in a larger team that already has database dependencies on Oracle or MySQL, then it's okay, right? It's not terrible. You can still write migration scripts and do it. But it's just that I've seen that this certainly doesn't hurt to not have to write those migrations when you don't want for them to be written. There's more differences, and again, there's pros and cons on both sides. But I just want to at least speak to that particular item in this video. Hopefully, it helped some of you. Thanks.